Hello you, it's me. This video is a bit different. This is a compilation of books that I read over the course of 2022. Although honestly, I have no idea how to do singular in-depth reviews for, or that I feel I don't have an awful lot to say and I didn't want to put up a video that was a minute and a half long dedicated to a book. So here's some stuff I read last year that I'll tell you a bit about, but only a little bit. The Longest Walk by Giuseppe Maniscalco. This was published in the 70s and is the true story of a man's trek from Ethiopia to South Africa, avoiding military action, criminals, and African wildlife along the way. This paints a really pretty view of Central Africa, with his walking into villages, all the chiefs being immediately impressed with him, his survival, his prowess, showering him with gifts, trying to convince him to choose brides. Whether that's embellishment by a white hero or a testament to the friendliness of tribal peoples, it's hard to tell, but it didn't read as particularly condescending. I think the most interesting parts of this for me were reading about the grueling physical stuff he had to overcome. I'm more a fan of the survival aspect of this book than the interactions with people aspect of it. I don't read a lot of real life stuff, and I thought this was going to be in the same vein as that Alvarez book I read year before last now. But this one was a bit more rosy-cheeked. 50 Words for Snow by Nancy Campbell. I got a reading copy of this when it was one of the Waterstones books of the month back in 2021, and honestly didn't expect much of it, but I was wrong. This was so lovely. It's 50 very important pieces of writing about what snow means to various cultures around the world, some of which you wouldn't expect to have had any interaction with snow in the last few thousand years. Whether that be fairy tales, traditions, historical accounts. I learned a lot reading this, and I think we underestimate the cultural role that winter plays in non-Northern Hemisphere countries especially. And I think this book does a really good job of broadening your view. It's clear that the author is a lover of winter, and that's the thing that immediately comes across. I really recommend this if you are sick of summer and you are waiting for the long dark nights to arrive with eager anticipation. A Field Guide to the Little People by Nancy Arrowsmith. This is an almanac type book describing the habitats, habits, and folklore surrounding fey creatures mostly of Europe and Russia. It's weird in that there is this almost half-hearted attempt to taxonomize them and divide them into separate categories by things like physical similarity, which I haven't seen in this kind of almanac fairy book before. After each of the articles about the creatures, there are short stories or accounts of them being involved in larger works. It's interesting to me to see how in some cultures there are pervasive themes, like German sprites often being associated with cattle and the hearth, and Italian sprites being associated with mountain roads and masquerading as people. It's also really interesting to see how one root creature could be twisted into 5 different interpretations by different cultures, but still examining them all together, you can see the seed idea at the core. This is a really cute book. I do wish there was some more American and Southern Hemisphere stuff. Maybe an expanded edition needs to happen, or an edition with different illustrations. Oh my god, they were terrible. Just really not the art style for me at all. Like that. They're super stylized. Remind me a little bit of David McKee, but kind of like if David McKee were locked in a room and in the dark and beaten for 10 years. The Book of English Magic by Phillip Carr-Gomm and Richard Heygate. This one is less a history book than a showcasing of all the different facets of English magic throughout history, and either their revival movements or their continued survival today. I have such mixed feelings on this book because I loved exactly half of it. It's divided into chapters by religious belief or system of magic, or prominent figures in England's magical past. It's very interesting to read. I wasn't a huge fan of how every single chapter ended with a weird testimonial by either a modern practitioner of a certain kind of magic or a historian talking about their specialist subject. A lot of the ones by practitioners seem to center around how inaccessible magic is and how hard they've worked to get where they are and how it'll take you your whole life to dedicate it to the sort of thing that they do. But on the opposite side of the coin to that, there were these very nicely laid out pieces with lists of resources telling you where you can find out more, how you can learn. So on one hand, you have the magic is a very hard club to get into, and on the other hand, you have here's how you get into it. It lists articles, publications, websites, clubs, societies, and really one thing I was impressed by is how well this book cites. So whether you read this for the history or whether you read it for instruction on how to slip into a dark magical underworld that apparently very much exists, I think it's worth a read. It talks a lot about the influence of other cultures mixing their belief system with native Britons and how the magic of the country really evolved from that cross-cultural exchange. I thought it was very cool. I learned a lot. Madame Zero by Sarah Hall. I picked this up because I was chasing the high from Salt Slow, Nudibranch, Parallel Hells, and other kick-ass short story collections. This turned out to be more contemporary than I was expecting. While the stories were open-ended and they were open to a lot of interpretation, they really lacked that gut punch pizzazz that the other collections had. And while I remember enjoying them as I read them, now I could not tell you what a single one of these stories was about. Communion by Whitley Strieber. Strieber? This is one I've been wanting to read for ages, and it is the author's supposedly true account of their alien abductions and encounters with non-human entities. It's very hard to review this book without the review devolving into, do I believe this guy or not? He's got a very earnest writing style. He seems very genuine, very convincing, but it's hard to tell whether that's calculated when the object of the book is to get his word out there and to get people to believe him. One thing he talks about a lot, and one of the things I really liked, was that he seems very aware that he might just be insane. And this might totally be occurring in his own mind. And then talks about how, even if it's not a real thing that's physically happening, surely just the fact that it's a shared experience is worth investigating. One of my biggest fears in the whole world is Hollywood grey aliens with big black eyes. Don't ask why. So there were big parts of this book which were honestly terrifying for me to read. That shot of the side of the alien's head coming around the edge of the door frame, which was in the movie, I think. It had a movie adaptation with Christopher Walken in, weirdly. That picture makes me feel physically sick every time I see it. So this was a very scary October read for me. In comparison to other UFO books I've read, and I have read a few, this one had less in terms of the UFO community, worldwide phenomena, that sort of thing. This is a book about one famous man and his one famous story. I thought it was pretty good. I thought it was egocentric in the way that a lot of UFO abductee case books seem to be, often with that chosen one theme that is pervasive throughout. But still interesting. I would say still read this because it's honestly entertaining. Folk Tales of the North American Indian by Henry Rowe Schoolcraft. I love folklore and I love a fairy tale. I think this book is actually a best of collection, with the stories having been taken from a larger book called the North American Fairy Book. I think these are probably quite bad translations of original stories. A lot of them have threads that just vanish halfway through the book, through the story, even though the story is only a few pages long. The story subject changes like that. The interesting thing with collections like these, especially when they're all so blurred together that I couldn't pick a favourite, are the recurring themes throughout the stories. A lot of them revolve around man dominating animals, being the ruling creature, hunting and eating everything, or people challenging each other to contests like running races and staking their life on it. I do think it's interesting reading stories where spirits are as casually mentioned as people and were clearly considered a very important aspect of everyday life to Native Americans. One thing I thought was super weird about this collection was how a lot of them open with the same thing, that being, when all the people in the land had died and there were just 2 people left, there's this idea constantly of post-desolation, and I wonder whether that came from historical violence and colonization or disease, or whether it's just a yearning for solitude, and they thought solitude was something that was worth attaining. The Book of Werewolves by Sabine Baring-Gould. This one is a reprint of a mid-19th century book about the werewolf myths across various cultures. It's immediately interesting that this feels like a book written to actively disprove the existence of werewolves. Through gathered stories and evidence and interviews, it proposes that most cases of lycanthropy are either humans suffering from delusions or wolves which have gained a taste for human flesh. But from this really vehement attempt to disprove the myths, you can tell that when this was written, it was something that, especially in rural communities, was something that was widely believed. It's interesting, talking in the other books in this video about recurring themes, one of the things that pops up again and again, which does come across as very strange, is the transformation being caused by a magic belt, cultures seemingly disconnected, and the transformation being brought about by a magic salve. It's weird that those are very specific things. It's a good book, but it dictates almost the whole last third of the book to the court case of somebody who is arrested in France for the murder of lots of children, and that has not a lot to do with what the rest of the book is about. Feels out of place, kind of disconnected. I'd still say read this though. Interesting. Deliverance by Jason Bray. I got this one for Christmas from my sister this year. Smashed through it in a couple of days. It met my expectations in some ways, and in others, really didn't. It's about the procedure and protocol followed by exorcists within the Anglican Church, who are called by the Anglican Church Deliverance ministers. It's a really interesting insight into a world you don't often see. Most people, myself included, holding the belief that exorcism is a very Catholic thing. It's interesting to see the types of haunting, the types of possession, and how they are classified by the church. It's also interesting and kind of reassuring that exorcism for the deliverance ministers is an absolute last resort, and that their priority is identifying when somebody is having a mental health crisis. Unfortunately, this did kind of make the documenting past cases sections of the book kind of bland and monotonous in the cases where it wasn't somebody who was sick or lying. Because in the end, they are all the same. Jason turns up. The house is a bit dingy. They're told a story of some things that happened in the house. They do the exorcism. They press the "God, can you come and help me" button, and then everything is fine. Half the book could be the exact same story, just with a different old lady and a different description of a living room. So yeah, a weird one. Half really interesting and then half really bland. The last one is The Secret Commonwealth of Elves, Fauns and Fairies by Robert Kirk. This one is a really short piece on people in Scotland in the 1800s and their relationship with the unseen folk, with fairies. It's an especially weird one because it feels like the author is trying to reconcile their belief in fairies with their belief in God and their responsibility as a member of the clergy. And it remarks on the fact a lot that in rural parts of the country, these belief systems are so intertwined as to be inseparable. There's some interesting bits in it. One of them being that people are born with the sight, and that is what allows them to see fairies, that the sight is something that can be shared. It talks about ways to gain the sight, which are very cool, that I hadn't come across in anything before. I'll read one to you. He must run a tether of hair, which bound a corpse to the bier, in a helix about his middle from end to end, then bow his head downwards, as did Elijah, 1 Kings 18:42, and look back through his legs until he see a funeral service, till the people cross 2 marches, or look back thus through a hole where was a knot of fur. Even that shows how intertwined the fairies and Christianity, quoting biblical verse, to gain magical powers, is. The second part of the book is a correspondence between two researchers with some interesting questions about the site. The whole thing's really short. Without the introduction, the prologue, and the why this book is being reprinted, blah, 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 at the front, and the letters at the end, the whole bit in the middle, the meat of it, is only like 40 pages long. But worth the read if you're interested in the folklore religion borderline and how belief systems interact. So those are my mini reviews for all those books. I feel like that's a better way to do it than doing a single video that's like 40 seconds long. So maybe I'll accrue some more this year in 2023 and do another one of these videos around Christmas. So thanks for tuning in. The Twitter and Goodreads links to me will be in the description below, and the link to the Interstellar Book Club, the sci-fi book club I run. If you want to join that, you're more than welcome. We'd love to have you on board. And I'll see you soon for the next review. Bye!